So as I said today, we'll be going an overview over the RhodeWorks Accelerated Transportation Program, talking about a little bit more of the focus of the analysis behind it, going over the results, and then we'll be doing a model demo in TranSight, looking at some of those construction financing impacts that are seen in the RhodeWorks program and layering on some network improvements. So again, as I said yesterday, I know there's a lot of familiar faces here attending, but these next few slides will be repeat. I just want to be able to give some background and information on REMI and TranSight before jumping into the case study for anyone that's just joining us for the first time this week. So, REMI's mission from its founding in 1980 is very simple. It's all about improving public policy decisions. So we've become the industry standard for providing economic forecasting and impact models that are then used to evaluate the impacts of economic development initiatives, transportation infrastructure improvements, fiscal policy, and other what-if questions about the economic, demographic, fiscal impacts of policy for our clients, including state and federal agencies, university research centers, private sector consultants, think tanks, and others. So in the transportation and planning spaces, some of the ways that REMI and TranSight specifically are often applied are in tip and state planning, just general economic impact analysis, project prioritization, transportation financing, as you will see today, and as well as long-range and strategic planning efforts. So REMI takes a very dynamic, unique approach to economic modeling, and it's kind of layered on a combination of techniques in economic theory that allow our users to produce very comprehensive analyses of economic impact. So it's kind of four components that make up the REMI model. There's a general equilibrium component, so it's thinking about how the economy is going to react to shocks, policy changes, etc., over time, allowing us to estimate the long-run stability of an economy. In the analysis of policy decisions and changes. There's also an input-output component that's taking a look at the close analysis of inter-industry relationships in our economies. Econometric component, so these are the thousands of equations that have been peer-reviewed, all peer-reviewed over REMI's 40-year history that allow us to do the advanced statistical analyses that really underpin the REMI model. There's also an economic geography component, so that's thinking about the effects of geographic concentration of labor and industry and how that has impacts on the economy. And you can see some of our clients to the right. As I mentioned, we work with state departments of transportation, such as Michigan, Illinois. We work with a lot of MPOs across the country, such as Southern California Association of Governments, San Diego Association of Governments, Houston Galveston Area Council, among others, and other private sector consultants, such as AECOM, Cambridge Systematics, and among many others that are not listed here. So as I had mentioned in the previous slide, REMI takes a dynamic approach to economic modeling, and this is kind of meant to go beyond static models by taking into account changes in economic conditions that happen over time. This allows us to compare policy situations or scenarios to baselines, and also compare and contrast different what-if scenarios to each other. As I mentioned, it's critical to, especially in transportation policy and planning and projects, to capture the impacts of a project or an investment over time as those impacts from the benefit play out. REMI tries to do this by utilizing the dynamic nature of its model to account for how, whether it's a transportation infrastructure project, is going to change factors such as emission savings, network improvements, safety improvements, demographic changes, all in addition to those initial impacts of construction that all play out over time. So we're going to take these into account and kind of evaluate how they will impact the economy. And users can model transportation network changes in TranSight with or without a travel demand model. This can be done by seamlessly integrating any major travel demand model and then taking those inputs like VMTs, VHTs, and trips and inputting them to get economic results. But we were also able to do it without a travel demand model, by inputting changes in transportation costs, accessibility costs, and commuting costs directly within TranSight if there is no travel demand model. So Our clients have been able to effectively analyze transportation policy, both with and without the use of travel demand models. So TranSight's kind of built in that flexibility to still provide credible analysis either way. And it's also built around a full-fledged economic model. So that allows us to take into account the associated costs of financing a transportation project, things like reallocating government expenditures or raising taxes. This is something you'll see a little bit of in the RhodeWorks case study. And again, it's important to include financing options in any transportation analysis, because these costs are also going to affect the other region's economic actors, which need to be accounted for when looking at transportation projects comprehensively. And again, these you'll kind of be able to get an idea of how REMI does this in the RhodeWorks case study. So, getting into the RhodeWorks case study here, just a little bit of background first. At the time, as of year 2014, Rhode Island ranked last in the nation for overall bridge condition. The degradation of the roads and bridges in the state had reached a point where, if many of those failing infrastructure corridors were not repaired, the cost would become increased, as the state would kind of then have to think about replacing entire bridges and roads rather than just repairing or upgrading them. It's also important to note that Rhode Island is the second most densely populated state in the nation, only second to my home state of New Jersey. It contains a really heavily traveled portion of I-95, in addition to several other transportation corridors in the Northeast. As it's kind of situated between New York City and Boston, and the ability to move goods and services, as many of you know, to markets quickly. Creating efficient access to supply chains, access to labor markets, are really critical for any economy. And the poor state of the infrastructure I just outlined made accomplishing these difficult and less efficient than an improved infrastructure would otherwise allow. So the RhodeWorks plan was the accelerated transportation plan to address these issues. It sought to achieve a goal of 90% structurally sufficient bridges, which is the federally mandated minimum, by the year of 2025, with the intention of also having safety improvements. This would ultimately make Rhode Island more attractive for businesses, workers, and benefit local consumers as well. So REMI was engaged by the Rhode Island Department of Revenue's Office of Revenue Analysis on behalf of the Rhode Island Department of Transportation to model the economic demographic effects of the RhodeWorks plan. So the Department of Revenue and also the Office of Management and Budget and Rhode Island Department of Transportation helped REMI to provide data for the analysis. And then REMI used its model of the Rhode Island state economy and calibrated that to the control forecast, and to closely adhere to the state's consensus economic forecast, which was adopted at the Revenue Estimating Conference in May of 2015. In Rhode Island Department of Transportation provided a current road and bridge maintenance plan, and this was kind of referred throughout the report as the Constrained Resources Plan, and it's meant to reflect the baseline that would be implemented in the absence of RhodeWorks. REMI also worked with the Rhode Island Department of Transportation to reflect the types of project spending variables that would be used for the purpose of the analysis. And then the Office of Revenue Analysis helped REMI by providing various points of clarification, regarding financing options, data inquiries, avoiding costs of bridge closings and postings, among others. So after that baseline forecast was built for the Rhode Island economy, REMI aggregated 8 scenarios that were determined by their own respective project components and potential outcomes. So 8 scenarios distinguished by 2 financing mechanisms, tolling and increases in either a gas or diesel tax, or both. And then the second determinant or distinguisher was the transportation infrastructure capital spending plan associated with each scenario, which included kind of the $400 million in federal funding that would be used for the 610 transit development. So These 8 scenarios actually can be seen here in the scenario key on the right. Scenario 1 represents the full, complete RhodeWorks proposal. So in this scenario, all of the financing would be done through a bridge tolling regime implemented on the state's interstates and major highways. Tolls were charged only to full-size REMI tractor trailers. That's Class 8 trucks and above, according to the Federal Highway Administration. And then Scenario 1 also accounted for the $400 million in federal funding for the development of the 610 transit system. Scenario 2 represents the same as the full RhodeWorks proposal, minus that $400 million in funding for the 610 transit development. Scenarios 3, 5, and 7 all include the same transportation infrastructure spending as scenario 1, so that they all account for the $400 million in federal funding. However, where they differ from scenario 1 and each other is their financing, which were both combinations of the tolling regime and then gas and diesel taxes. So scenario 3 includes the tolling regime, but also an increase in gas tax, but there's no increase in a diesel tax. Scenario 5 obviously includes the tolling regime again, but there's no increase in a diesel tax, there's no increase in a gas tax, but an increase in the diesel tax. Scenario 7, there also includes the tolling regime and increases in both gas and diesel tax. So regarding scenarios 4, 6, and 8, they all have the same financing as scenarios 3, 5, and 7 respectively, but the difference is that they do not account for the $400 million in federal funding for the 610 transit development. So REMI's analysis included the economic and demographic impacts over an 11-year time period associated with 4 things: the construction of transportation infrastructure capital improvements, the financing options for the project, the avoided costs of bridge closings and postings to the state, and postings here is talking about weight limit postings, as well as benefit programs to support the trucking industry that were included in the RhodeWorks proposal. It's important to note here, as you can see, that the scope of the analysis was focused on just the construction and financing of this project. It did not get into any analysis on network improvements because that was just the scope of the project. When I get into the model demo later, I'll look at a hypothetical scenario that kind of layers transportation network improvements on top of similar construction and financing effects. So this analysis only accounted for spending that was estimated to be different from the constrained resources plan. Again, that's kind of the baseline that would be executed in the absence of RhodeWorks. The capital improvements data reflected actual construction and development related activities when building and repairing the relevant transportation infrastructure. So 610 highway, that's kind of referring to the highway and bridge construction along the Route 610 corridor. The total spending for this activity is $400 million spread between 2016 and 2021. The way that REMI modeled that was using our detailed translator variable for industry sales of highway, street, and bridge construction. 610 transit, this was part of the designated 610 highway interchange and corridor reconstruction. This is referring to the development of designated bus rapid transit infrastructure, and this is the $400 million in additional federal transit dollars that would go into the project if approved by the federal government. To best reflect this type of construction, the way that REMI modeled it was again using the same detailed variable for industry sales and highway, street, and bridge construction. There's also bridge capital or pipeline capital improvements. Again, this is referring to general bridge repairs. So the total spending here actually ended up being a decrease of nearly $13 million. This is because this reflects the cost savings from avoiding bridge closures and postings. And again, when I say postings, I'm just referring to weight limit postings that started in year 6 and then had net cost savings over that 11-year period due to the accelerated spending within the first 5 years of the RhodeWorks program. Because this decrease in spending alone would demand less local inputs and labor, REMI modeled this, the cost savings here, as a loss in total detailed industry sales and highway, street, and bridge construction. Pavement capital, That was a $58.5 million in spending that was funded directly through tolling revenue. It's just referring to general road resurfacing and paving activities. And once again, the detailed industry sales, highway, street, and road construction policy variable was used to model this in REMI. Regarding transit capital projects, total spending for this was just under $80 million, which came from the RhodeWorks data provided by Rhode Island Department of Transportation. It included investments to rebuild and develop rail and/or bus terminals, dedicated bus lanes, repair and maintenance of rail lines, facility maintenance, and some capital equipment spending as well. So there was no specific specification of spending category. So REMI modeled this as exogenous final demand for construction. Gantry construction, this is referring to the construction of high-speed tolling gantries, and was modeled in REMI as industry sales for the construction sector. And then lastly, there was a transportation alternatives capital pipeline, and this is just talking about the development of potential smaller transportation-related capital improvement projects. One of the specifics mentioned was something like a bike lane. This category included spending of $19.6 million, and that was spread over 7 years starting in 2015. And the way that this was modeled in the REMI model was as general construction within the state. So to reflect the economic impacts to Rhode Island and the Rhode Island economy, from the in-state funding sources, all of the in-state financing impacts are modeled starting in 2017, and then are modeled through the analysis period ending in 2025. So, for the tolling program, only charges a use fee to full semi-tractor trailers, and again, that was Class 8 and above. Two important points that to make about how REMI modeled the tolling program. Point number one would be REMI modeled an increased production cost of $5 million for the truck transportation industry, which this is meant to account for the net cost impact to the state's transportation or the state's truck transportation industry. And then the other point would be REMI distinguished the types of semi-tractor trailer traffic into 4 different categories. So one of those was local traffic. So this is tractor trailer trucks with an origin and destination in Rhode Island. There's outbound traffic. So that's, a trip origins originating in Rhode Island. And then there's an out-of-state destination. Pass-through traffic, which was kind of referring to, an origin and destination outside of Rhode Island. So just thinking about Rhode Island as, just passing through, something like traveling from New York City to Boston, and then inbound traffic. So this was trucks traveling with an out-of-state origin and a trip destination within the state of Rhode Island. So inbound traffic was assumed with consultation from the Office of Revenue Analysis to pose the toll cost incurred from the trip to Rhode Island onto Rhode Island businesses and local and state government. So this was estimated to be $12.79 million, which was then added to the $5 million impact to the Rhode Island trucking industry. And then regarding gas and diesel taxes, 3 scenarios for gas and diesel taxing were analyzed, all of which reflect a $12.5 million increase in fuel tax from the years of 2017 to 2025. So there was a gas and diesel tax, just a diesel tax, and then a gas and diesel tax, but with an additional tax on diesel. And REMI modeled this by increasing the policy variable of consumer price on motor vehicle fuels, lubricants, and fluids.